Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Larry Holsworth with some edits by Karl Smallwood, so be sure to give them both some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about new places and the people that made them famous. Let's get to it. It isn't hidden by any means, but the community of Tangier, located on an island of the same name, is as remote as any community in the 48 contiguous United States. It is also threatened. It likely will need to be abandoned in another 5 decades or so, as rising sea levels swallow up most of the island. It has been occupied by those of European and African descent for more than 2.5 centuries, and by pre-Columbian peoples long before that. It has been fought over by Americans, British, and Native peoples in warfare, and by oystermen and fishermen in marginally less lethal fish-based combat as well. Tangier Island sits in the Chesapeake Bay, officially as part of the Commonwealth of Virginia in the county of Accomack. It is so low-lying that it is barely visible even just a short distance from its shores. It can only be reached by water, either by private boat or paid scheduled ferry services, and anyone who's watched the excellent Midnight Mass probably already has a mental image in their head of what this island probably looks like. It holds the distinction of being the last place in Virginia to have been occupied by British troops during the War of 1812, with the last British troops departing the island in March 1815. They took with them several African Americans who, having been freed from enslavement in Virginia, found themselves conscripted into the British Army and sent to the only British colony colder and wetter than Britain itself. Of course, we're talking about Canada. Fewer than 450 people reside permanently on the island as of 2024. They subsist primarily from tourism. The population of the tiny island speaks a distinct dialect, which some claim is reminiscent of the language spoken by the earliest English settlers to Virginia and nearby Maryland. Others dispute this claim, arguing that the dialect is derived from the several different dialects from the region rather than from Old English or Welsh. There is considerable debate over the issue, at least among those inclined to debate such matters. And Karl has a note here saying that there is a fun Welsh word that you can all fold into your vocabulary, and it's pronounced Yakida, which roughly translates to cheers. So, Yakida. Thanks, Karl. Since 1850, well over half of the island has been claimed by the waters of Chesapeake Bay, and in recent years, the rate of sea rise has steadily increased. Whether triggered by climate change or not, studies have found that the island, like so many other low-lying barrier islands, will require abandonment in the next few decades. If so, it will mark the end of human exploitation of Tangier and nearby smaller islands, which has lasted several centuries. As noted, today the island community is primarily a tourist destination, and its economy relies on the tourism dollar. Such was not always the case, though. The small Virginia community has a long and varied past. Here is some of its story. The observation that it was a brave man who first ate an oyster is usually attributed to Jonathan Swift, though there is ample evidence that similar observations were recorded over a century earlier. No matter who said it first, it is clear whether bravery required or not, men and women sure ate a lot of them. In all societies in England and the European continent, in African waters, in Asia, and not to be outdone in pre-Columbian America, oysters were consumed by the millions, their shells converted to tools, fortifications, roadbeds, and shelters. For anyone hearing that last part who is currently thinking, wait, did people make houses out of oyster shells like the editor did? It turns out oyster shells can be processed into lime, which is cool, we guess. Anyway, Chesapeake Bay was once home to countless oysters. Before the arrival of the Europeans, they were harvested by local Indian tribes, who often used their shells as cutting weapons and blades. Unused shells were dumped in locations which became middens. Their existence today is evidence of the reliance of pre-Columbian peoples on the humble oyster. Oysters were so prevalent in Chesapeake Bay that their beds often grew to the size of reefs, just barely beneath the surface of the water, waiting to rip out the bottom of a wooden craft that sailed too close. John Smith, who explored much of the Chesapeake Bay for the Virginia Company in the early 17th century, wrote of oysters lying thick as stones in the bay and its tributaries. The same John Smith visited the island region in 1608, reporting the area, which he called the Russell Isles, as uninhabited. The existence of a large oyster midden on Tangier discovered in the 20th century stands as mute evidence that the natives resorted to the island in the 17th century. Other artifacts support this theory, though there is no evidence of settlements on the island prior to the arrival of the Europeans. They likely visited the area by canoe, using it for hunting, trapping, and fishing. In winter months, the waters of Chesapeake Bay were the home of more than half of the population of canvasback ducks found in North America. Canvasbacks were considered the finest of all game birds for dining before hunting pressures and the loss of natural habitat led them to becoming endangered and thus even more delicious. The waters of Chesapeake Bay also provided rich harvests of fish, crabs, mussels, clams, ducks, geese, and in the Martians, pigeons, including the now extinct passenger pigeon, another too delicious for its own good bird prized for the table. Yet, the first known habitation of Tangier was not for the purpose of harvesting the richness of the bay. It was for the purpose of animal husbandry. Accomack, Virginia, in what is today the eastern shore of the Commonwealth, was one of the original 8 shires or counties of the colony. In 1670, Ambrose White, a tavern keeper, successfully lobbied for a land patent for Tangier Island. The following year, White transferred his patent to 2 of the wealthiest citizens of Accomack County, landowners and planters John West and Charles Scarborough. They used the tiny island to pasture livestock. Grazing remained the primary activity on the island for the next century, with the only permanent residents being cattle, sheep, and hogs. Local lore designates John Crockett as the first permanent human resident to inhabit the island around 1770, and if current demographics of the island today are anything to go by, he was certainly busy, but not with animal rearing. We say this because to this day, Crockett is still a popular surname on the island of less than 500. As for Crockett himself, he first attempted farming, but gradually he and his many descendants and a growing community of neighbors began earning their living from the waters of the bay. At the beginning of the 19th century, there was no oystering industry in the United States beyond local oystermen selling their catch. Oysters were harvested in one of 2 ways, tonging and dredging. Tonging consisted of manipulating long-handled tongs attached to baskets and hauling the oysters caught by the baskets into a boat, usually a dugout canoe. Dredging, which emerged later in the century, required the hauling of a dredge across the oyster beds, dragging the oysters into a basket and eventually the boat. In both methods, the oysters were then cold, with rejects and empty shells simply returned to the water. As Americans moved west deeper into the hinterland, their taste for oysters went with them. At first, oysters were shipped via rivers, later by railroads, packed in seaweed and salt, and arriving at their destinations still living. Not all oysters were the same. Differences in the salinity and temperature of the water from which they were harvested made some oysters more prized than others. Those from Chesapeake Bay were prized throughout the country, with some connoisseurs claiming they could even detect which area of the bay a particular oyster was from simply from its taste. This is of course a load of crap, but it probably made whoever said it sound super fancy. For the curious, it is possible for a particularly seasoned palate to detect roughly where an oyster is from, as the taste of a particular oyster is influenced by what the oyster itself ate and the quality salinity of the water from which it was harvested. However, pinpointing the exact place an oyster was plucked out of the water isn't really a thing due to the sheer number of factors in play. Everything from the depth of the water to pollution can impact taste, and there are very few places on Earth where these things are consistent. The exception being dedicated oyster farms which seek to normalize the conditions that oysters are exposed to. As one article on the subject notes, because oysters are literally cemented to the substrate, it's hard to find any other food where you taste place with such specificity. However, being able to pinpoint this place through taste alone is like a wine lover telling you they can tell which side of the vine the grapes used to make it were grown. Back to oysters from Tangier. Ones harvested here were among the most prized of all. Oystering flourished on Tangier, with the produce of the oystermen traveling to restaurants and markets. Oystering continued to grow in size and profits throughout the 19th century, with Chesapeake Bay annually producing bigger and bigger harvests. It seemed as if the demand for oysters was insatiable, and the bay's ability to meet the demand scarcely tapped. The competition between oystermen in Maryland and Virginia grew, particularly in the waters near the eastern shore, where both states claimed jurisdiction over the waters. Following the American Civil War, open conflict between oystermen from competing states occurred with increasing frequency on the bay. In the 1870s, Maryland barred the practice of dredging in its waters, which Virginia oystermen frequently ignored. So the other oystermen decided to shoot at them. Oh, and the pirates, who also came to scoop up as many oysters as they could. Yes, you heard that correctly. There was a time when there were literal oyster pirates roaming the shores of America looking to steal rocks full of snot. The threat of oyster pirates, of course, led to the creation of an oyster navy to combat them. An oyster navy first led by the appropriately named Hunter Davidson. To be clear, none of that is made up, and the federal government really did create a waterborne militarized force with the sole goal of breaking up fights between oyster farmers and pirates. And here's the really wild part. The Oyster Navy got its ass kicked repeatedly because the oyster farmers were better armed. Eventually, the Oyster Navy got a little better at fighting the pirates, with the governor of Virginia, William E. Cameron, going as far as to personally hunt down pirates on a tug called, get this, the Peed. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though, with the governor once having to deal with the mockery from both sides of the political aisle when his ship was outrun by 3 women, a mother and her 2 daughters, in full buxom wench attire. The women not only got away, but according to reports from the time, laughed at the governor the entire time and were cheered on by people on the beach who put aside their usual animosity for pirates, largely because the whole thing was really funny. The so-called Oyster Wars, despite sounding like something from the distant past, actually lasted all the way to the 1950s, only ending when one illegal dredger was shot and killed, leading to the disbanding of the Oyster Navy. Before the Oyster Wars, though, the waters around the bay had been a region of conflict of a much different kind, a battle between nations. In 1814, after 2 years of warfare between Britain and America along the Canadian frontier, the British decided to invade the United States by fully exploiting their naval superiority. Their plan was to sail up Chesapeake Bay, land troops to attack, and capture Washington, and then move on to Baltimore. The latter was selected because of that city's notorious harbor sheltering privateers, which wreaked havoc with Britain's Caribbean commerce. Despite the presence of a naval base and fortress near the Virginia Capes, the Atlantic gateway into the Chesapeake Bay, the British fleet blithely sailed through. America's few remaining frigates could do little more than shelter themselves on inland rivers protected by artillery batteries ashore, as well as a few gunboats. The British fleet cruised Chesapeake Bay with impunity, landing parties to engage in the British tradition of taking other people's stuff, with little concern for American rights and even less for local militia. The British commander of the expedition was Rear Admiral George Cockburn, who had orders from his superiors to destroy and lay waste such towns and districts as you may find assailable. Cockburn needed an advanced base where his fleet could perform needed maintenance on its ships and the army could prepare for inland operations. He selected Tangier Island. The British had occupied Tangier in 1813, confiscating the fishing and oystering vessels found there and established a fortification they named Fort Albion. From the small island, raiding parties were sent to the eastern shores of Maryland and Virginia to gather forage for humans and horses. The British considered any American with firearms to be a potential enemy. And as most Americans of the region then held firearms, they were thus subject to restraint by the British. Whenever slaves were encountered, they were confiscated and taken to British encampments, where they were told they were free. However, they were not technically free, as the moment they attempted to leave British camps, they would be subject to recapture by their former owners. As you might imagine, many slaves opted to stick with the British, who gave them a uniform, a gun, and the opportunity to shoot at the people who'd put a yoke around their neck. Relatable. A grim irony of the Civil War is that for many enslaved people, the British redcoat was a welcome sight and represented the very freedom the people who saw them as little more than property were fighting for. Most able-bodied men were thus encouraged to enter the British Army. British promises of freedom thus became conscription, and most freed slaves traveled with the British Army when it retreated to Canada after the expedition was defeated at Baltimore in 1814. On Tangier, the British occupation of the island was one of extreme hardships for the troops, and even worse for the residents of the island. Drinking water was scarce, so was food. Foraging parties often deserted, the conscripted troops opting for a new life in America over the privilege of serving in the British Army. When local newspapers reported the deserters as being captured by local militia, Cockburn ordered retaliatory raids on nearby villages and farms. Garrison troops remained at Tangier in Fort Albion when the expedition moved against and eventually burned part of Washington in August 1814. They returned to Tangier before moving against Baltimore in September, where they were defeated in their attempt to subdue Fort McHenry. Following the defeat at Baltimore, most of the expedition was moved to participate in the planned conquest of the Mississippi Valley, though a large garrison was retained at Tangier to man Fort Albion and provide shelter for those slaves who sought British protection. The official British policy was formalized as offering enslaved peoples the choice of either entering into His Majesty's sea or land forces or being sent as free settlers to the British possessions in North America or the West Indies. Following the ratification of the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, the British evacuated Fort Albion and Tangier Island, but not before burning the fort they constructed to the ground. Between the destruction initiated by the departing British and subsequent storms and erosion, no trace of Fort Albion remains today, and much of the land where the fortification stood is now under the rising waters of the Chesapeake Bay. The sea, as it's often said, eventually takes all. While oystering still exists on Tangier, it is no longer a major industry, and most oysters taken are for local consumption. Beginning in the 1950s, Tangier's watermen, those who make their living from the bay, turned their attention to crabbing. Today, Tangier refers to itself as the soft-shell crab capital of the world. The small harbor is crowded with vessels. Both privately owned boats dock there by visitors and crab boats. Scattered throughout the waterfront are crab shanties, where crabs that have been caught are kept until they molt, losing their hard outer shell. Before the soft, newly exposed shell has time to harden, the crabs are sold as soft-shelled crabs, a Chesapeake Bay delicacy. They are frequently battered and fried and popular as sandwiches, so crab cakes. Crabs sold as soft-shelled crabs are blue crabs, a species commonly found in Chesapeake Bay. When they are near their molting time, the hard shell develops tiny cracks. To the Tangier watermen, they are known as peelers. There is then a short window of time in which they can be sold as soft-shelled. That window is not a definite period, and the crabber must rely on his own judgment and experience to make that determination. Today, about 13% of all annual blue crab harvests in the Chesapeake Bay are from Tangier, despite its being one of the smallest fisheries on the bay. In recent years, the heat of the summer months has seen larger numbers of the blue shell crabs dying in the holding tanks, unable to survive. Increased temperatures have been a trend throughout the 21st century, another indicator of climate change. For example, here in Richmond, we don't get snow anymore. We're lucky to get a dusting, but this was not the case in the past. To most Tangier crabbers, the increase in crabs dying before they can be sent to market is just bad luck, one of the many risks unavoidable in the lives and livelihoods of fishermen. They've been conducting business in the same manner for generations, and left alone to their own devices, their descendants will likely conduct their business in the same manner for generations to come. Fishing is not without risks, whether it be for scaled swimmers or crustaceans, and memorials to those Tangier residents who lost their lives in the bay are scattered throughout the community. The two active churches on the island have, by necessity, small graveyards, with available space all but gone. For that reason, Tangier residents have long interred their family dead in their own yards, where space is similarly limited. Those who died in the bay and were recovered are therefore often found on the grounds of the house in which they resided in life. The bay and the waters surrounding Tangier present dangers beyond the natural hazards of the sea. For nearly a century, Chesapeake Bay was used by the US Navy for shakedown and training cruises, including gunnery practice, mine laying, torpedo exercises, and other drills and tests needed to maintain military readiness. To the west of Tangier Island, buoys mark the remains of wrecked vessels sent to the bottom of the bay due to naval exercises. One such wreck is the former USS San Marcos, a ship similar in size and appearance to the famous USS Maine, sunk in Havana Harbor in 1898. San Marcos was sunk deliberately by the Navy in a gunfire exercise in March 1911. Subsequent to its sinking, the submerged hulk was used as a target in torpedo exercises and in aerial bombing demonstrations. Nonetheless, the sunken San Marcos has claimed several vessels as well, who struck the wreck submerged in the shallow water when they unwisely drew too close to the vessel. This gives the vessel the not unimpressive record of being one of the only naval vessels in history to have sunk another whilst underwater and unmanned. In the late 1950s, the hulk was visited by Navy divers, who packed explosives into its hull, shaped so as to drive the remains deeper into the mud on the bottom. They were successful, and the wreck has lain peacefully at rest since 1959. Crabbers and dredgers still occasionally encounter unexploded naval ordnance among their catches, though such incidents have been less frequently reported since the beginning of the 21st century. Caution is still recommended though, and diving near the known wrecks in the area is discouraged, due in part to the extremely limited visibility due to the murkiness of the water and, the bombs. While tourism in the summer months is a major boon to the island's economy, it is far from a tourist mecca. Overnight accommodations are scarce, mostly of the bed and breakfast variety. Scheduled ferry service is limited to the summer months. There is a small airstrip, but no regularly scheduled commercial air service. Tourists find the small island offers hiking trails, some focused on birding, others on local vegetation and history. Obviously, water sports such as diving, snorkeling, and swimming are freely available. Transportation is by bicycle, on foot, and in golf carts. There are few cars on the island. As of 2024, there were no ATMs either. While internet service is available, cell phone service is sporadic. Hikers enjoying the island's trails find little in the way of changes in elevation. The highest rise on the island is just 4 feet above sea level. The island is suffering from the effects of erosion caused by its continuing subsidence into the sea. In addition to the subsiding, the waters of Chesapeake Bay are rising steadily. The combination means that Tangier loses about 9 acres of land to the bay every year. Hurricanes and other severe storms, which have been increasing in both incidence and severity in the 21st century, are speeding the island's demise. The ecological threats to the island have contributed to its decline in population, which has steadily decreased over the last century. The current population, around 450 people, is the fewest to inhabit the island since the 1880 census. Broad efforts to protect Chesapeake Bay from the damages of centuries of overfishing have had a negative effect as well. Crabbing licenses have been frozen by both Virginia and Maryland, with no new licenses issued by either state. Limits on catches have decreased even as fuel costs have risen, making profitability a difficult goal. Larger areas of the bay have been designated as sanctuaries, designated to help replenish the dwindling crab population. Similar efforts have been made in the past protecting oysters and rockfish, both of which were overfished to the point of near extinction. Men and women who formerly practiced the time-honored profession of being a waterman, meaning they made their living fishing from the bay, have abandoned it for other pursuits, with many choosing to work on the tugs which drive barges on the bay and its many tributaries. Although Tangier calls itself the soft-shell crab capital of the world, the majority of crab meat sold is no longer from Chesapeake Bay. The vast majority of crab sold in the United States is imported from overseas or taken from Alaskan waters. The key for the consumer is the designation of Maryland-style crab on menus and packaging. If it reads Maryland-style, it likely does not come from the Chesapeake Bay. Though many have given up on Tangier, believing its future will end with its eventual disappearance into the Chesapeake Bay, others have not given up. With government assistance, steps to delay and possibly deter the island's eventual disappearance have been undertaken. Some houses have been razed, temporarily removing them from the danger of submergence. Stone jetties have been erected to slow the effects of erosion. A wind turbine farm to provide electricity to the island and sell to nearby Accomack on the eastern shore is under study as of 2024. Wind turbines already supply electricity locally, and additional farms selling power would be a source of both jobs and local income. Despite its promise, numerous local watermen oppose the idea, citing it as being detrimental to their fishing operations, particularly for conch. There are signs that Chesapeake Bay is recovering from the ill effects of both pollution and overfishing. Both oysters and rockfish are making comebacks in Maryland and Virginia waters. The signs of oyster recovery are particularly encouraging, since the bivalves serve as a critical filter of the waters in which they grow. A healthy oyster population is a promising sign for all species. Conservation efforts have unquestionably improved the health of the bay, yet most watermen oppose them as threatening their own livelihoods. Despite the encouraging signs, there are those who state unequivocally that Tangier Island is doomed. The 2015 study stated to a certainty that the island would be uninhabitable by the mid-21st century at the earliest and 2070 at the latest. That would be 400 years since it was first used by European descendants as a place to husband livestock. Of course, there are those who claim that climate change is a hoax, that the rising sea is a myth and generated for political gain, on top of all the increased storm intensity and heat domes as well, and that humanity has little impact on the Earth's ability to support and sustain them. Perhaps they're right, but they're probably not. There are little support for their arguments among those who want to apply actual science to not only identify Tangier's challenges, but to find solutions to them. The people of Tangier are conservative both in nature and in politics. They regard outsiders with warm welcomes coupled with wary reserve. A person visiting Tangier, even one who has come to stay and take up residence, is known in the native dialect as a come here. The next generation, should there be one, is known as a stay here. The next is referred to as a been here. Not until the fourth generation is a relatively recently arrived family known as a Tangierman. Such conservatism is contrary to the effects of losing the island to the rising seas, but such is the nature of the place. In many ways, it is lost to time, while in others it provides a clear sign of what the future holds for climate and the shaping of the globe. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment your favorite thing about the islands of Virginia, subscribe and ring that bell if you haven't, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historically significant places. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.